Once the Carolingian glory days fizzled out and fragmentation of holdings fractalized in Western Europe, there was a push by some for consolidation. The smartest, most capable Carolingian emperors, Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, had attempted to use the church as a consolidation of their power, investing heavily in monasteries and bishoprics for a better investment in support and resources, not to mention the far more important ecclesial and moral unity of their empire, which far outweighs anything merely material. Think Cluny, for example. An investment by the Duke of Aquitaine in monastic land, protection being directly under the Roman See and its pontiff, directly under the supervision of Saints Peter and Paul. Cluny was not the only establishment to seek papal immunities. A papal immunity was this very real grant that the lands owned by any person or community, in this case by monks, would be basically owned by the Pope in a material sense, but in a metaphysical sense, it meant the monastery would be the very property of the Saints Peter and Paul themselves. This would be the case with any monastery at the time regardless of the saint involved, which is why seizing monastic lands was such a big deal when it happened, since it was actually stealing from the very saints standing before God, and on the other hand, giving to the monastery was such a good thing, giving to those same saints. Like I said, it was usually monasteries getting these kinds of exemptions, which could come from the Pope or the King to be a royal monastery, but here we're talking about the papal privileges. One such example is Saint Abel of Fleury. While he was abbot of Fleury, he had a deep rivalry with his diocesan bishop, Arnulf of Orleans, the one on the Capetian side of the conflict that saw the Capetians get the upper hand over the Carolingian Charles and his monastic benefactors who disagreed with the way the bishops had conducted the trial of Arnulf of France, tried for treason. Abel is an interesting case because he went to the Pope a few times to get his desired immunities for Fleury, and finally got one from Pope Gregory V, the predecessor of Pope Sylvester II. Paradoxically, Saint Abel, was trying to increase the papal power in order to undermine the power of his direct oversight, the Bishop of Orleans. But at the same time, the popes, especially at the beginning, the first time the Pope actually basically required a gift in order to even have an audience with him. Even then, he still didn't get it. It was only Gregory V, who was one of the appointees of Otto III, which makes him less of the stock of Roman aristocracy. You can never underestimate the investiture controversy and the reforming papacy movement as a whole as a great force of good in medieval civilization, and that was accompanied with, and maybe it even necessitated, a papal oversight of the whole church. This privilege did things like forbid the Bishop of Orleans, or any bishop, from stepping on the lands of Fleury or saying Mass there without permission from the abbot of Fleury, whoever it might be. It also made the monastery directly answerable to the king and pope only, escaping episcopal jurisdiction and discipline. Protections could vary, no more privatas or gîte, which is when the abbey would have to provide housing for the bishop at his will. The monks of Fleury were to have the freedom to elect their own abbot and to choose a helpful advocate so that position, the position of advocate, would not become a hereditary post and become oppressive in any way to the monks. Also, Fleury, which by the way is Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire, would be exempt from any papal interdict over the Kingdom of the West Franks or over the Diocese of Orleans, in which the monastery was still located. Now we'll talk about the substance of the immunities of Pope Sylvester II itself. The immunities used consistent formulae from a book called the Liber Diurnus Romanorum Pontificum, which included hundreds of formulae to use for any kind of situation the Roman Chancery would have to produce a document for. So this explains why the privileges are quite consistent, sometimes to a word. Each privilege had a similar structure, which started with a beginning, which was usually a reason for what was to be done or its purpose. A couple of examples are, in the exemption given to Abbess Sophia of Quedlinburg, Otto III's sister, in April 999, Pope Sylvester writes, "Therefore, because the rights and the unavoidable obligations of divine laws require that whatever may legitimately and reasonably be requested from our apostolic benevolence be denied to no one, we deem it proper that if we have discovered in the privileges of our predecessors or in other sacred ecclesiastical documents statements and facts worth preserving, we should reaffirm these if requested by reiterating the evidence of their permanence." In Lombardy, the abbot of both San Salvatore and San Benito in Leno, Brescia, had requested that a manor held by San Benito be papally granted, received on April 19th, 999, an exemption, which says, "Because requests reasonably and suitably made by the faithful ought to be granted, we, as a result of our pious founder's devotion, must nowise restrict our liberality in bestowing privileges." As you might expect, not all of these exemptions and immunities went to abbots. Some of them went to bishops, like this one to Villerode of Strasbourg, just before he had died of malaria in Italy on an imperial expedition. He was given the convent of Andlau to, quote, protect and defend, at the same time to restore the religious observance after completely ousting the lay power. For the Pope, even though his grants manifested his ever-growing influence, which was compensation enough for himself, he was still to receive something in return. Often, he would give these grants and privileges in exchange for a payment for the carrying out of his commands. In the same privilege to Villerode of Strasbourg, he continues, "We are granting this decree not to remove it from the jurisdiction of St. Peter, but, because it is far away from us, we are entrusting its protection to the aforesaid church as a lesser to a greater, imposing the condition that as acknowledgment of our rights, 3 albs yearly be brought to us. But, if neglected in the first year, it will be doubled the second year. If the same in the second, it will be tripled in the third, and if neglected in the third, similarly, it will be quadrupled. If now the aforesaid are not paid in the 4th year, the Church of Strasbourg will forever lose the abbey. This will be so if such neglect of obligation occurs while the bishop is living." An alb, by the way, was a white undergarment shirt that would be worn by the clergy underneath their exterior robes, which Strasbourg was apparently a creator of. In a privilege granting to Count Diferio and his sons and grandsons the control of the county of Terracina directly from the papacy, we see, "Because it is well known that these and other possessions had been indifferently bestowed on others when they, the popes, turned their attention to profit and lost the greatest possession of the church with the smallest sort of rent in return, this sort of gift we are changing completely for the better, so that what we bestow under the name of benefice, though this document of our grant shall be for military service, this sort of return we deem proper, that knights shall offer allegiance in peace and arms in war for the honor and safety of the Holy Roman Church. But lest ecclesiastical property should pass into the possession or ownership of any one, we, disregarding any difficulty, have decreed that for this present 14th year of the indiction, 3 gold solidi shall be paid under the title of rent to the treasurer of the Holy Roman Church, to wit, in the month of January. But if it cannot be paid in the first year, the rent of the first and second years ought to be paid in the second year. Inclined by your prayers, through the terms of this decree with the county of Terracina and with everything pertaining to it, as recorded above." This was from December 26th of the year 1000. No small number of people might scorn at this and say, "Oh look, there's the papacy getting involved in warfare, or paying people and land to get services back and dealing and being worldly." But this is civilization. This is how this works. If you have territory in central Italy at the time where you have some Byzantines running around, you have the Norman Franks running around, the Saracens running around, you need to have control, and this is a good way to do it, is to basically extend your own influence by granting counties in exchange for service. This is actually the opposite of confusion and warfare. This is actually order. This is actually discipline. This is good. This is more peaceful than the alternative. So a lot of people accuse the church of being aggressive and mean and the bully in history, but that's the furthest from the truth, really. Now, what would happen if the pen of the Pope wasn't obeyed? We can read the Pope's warning in his immunity to the Abbey of Lorch in August 999. Quote, "As long as the abbot and the monks of this place shall live religiously and blessedly, they may remain in peace and quiet and without the objection of any person. If, however, they shall abandon religion and devote themselves to unpermitted and secular business, we decree that the Roman Pope must warn and correct them. If they do not mend their ways after being wanted by him, we turn them over to the royal power. Therefore, we wish this privilege, embodying our decree, to remain valid and inviolable for all time. But if anyone shall presume to make it void, First let him incur the wrath of God, and let him be anathema maranatha. That little thing at the end there, anathema maranatha, was apparently a misunderstanding of Pope Sylvester II on a quote from the New Testament that didn't really mean what he thought it meant. Basically, it meant something in St. Paul's words, but Pope Sylvester thought that it basically just meant like super anathema. So he said it in a few of his privileges. Now, more importantly about this, we see that the Pope works with the secular imperial authority and counts on the imperial authority because the imperial authority is also in charge of this abbey of Lorsch. So the Pope has his spiritual arm, but since he's obviously across the Alps and doesn't have the military forces to do so, being so blocked up in Italy, which we can look to the previous example of Count Di Ferio of Terracina, and we can say that he counted on the emperor to stop any unpermitted and secular business. Just about every immunity and concession ended with an anathema to finish off the threat to anyone who would dare to oppose the Pope's choices. The example here from April 18th, 999, given to the monastery of St. Lambert of Sayon, I hope I'm saying that right. If anyone by rash presumptuousness, however, shall attempt to try to do anything against the terms of this apostolic confirmation of ours, though such behavior is unbelievable, let him know that he has been bound by the chain of the anathema of our Lord and of Peter, Prince of the Apostles, to be consumed in the everlasting fire with the devil and his most vicious retinue, and with Judas, betrayer of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and at the same time, having been sent down into the Tartarian depths, let him perish with the wicked. So here's again that metaphysical idea of this not being just obeying the Pope, but actually St. Peter himself. If you disobey what the Pope has granted, you disobey what Peter has granted, and that puts you as betraying God and worthy of going to hell, being bound there by this decree. We really can honor the universality and wide breadth of this movement of grants to boost the Pope's power in Europe, because most of his privileges and contacts were Italians, Germans, and Catalans, which the Catalans make sense because he was around there for a time in his younger days, and German because he had some ties with the emperor, and especially with Theophanu and Adelaide. There's a lot I'll try to make some videos on that at some time in the future. One of his letters goes to Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, telling him to stop using runes and to use Latin letters instead. Another letter was to Bruno of Querfurt in 1002, giving him the pallium and calling him Archbishop of the Pagans, and given the mission to evangelize them in the northeast of Europe. One letter even went to Vladimir, Prince of Kiev, one to Boleslav Krobry of Poland. He confirms the episcopal structure Otto III set up in Poland and confirmed the Hungarian sees and gives Stephen I the right to be crowned King of Hungary. Some letters sent, like those to Venice to the Doge and Patriarch, were pushing them to reform their misbehaving clergy in order to be able to present themselves at a scheduled Roman synod the next year, in case anything went wrong or struggles ensued. Some were berating those who didn't appear before papal synods to answer for certain actions and behaviors. Some were, like with Arnulf of France, they were tying up loose ends where maybe Gerbert of Aurillac, who was Pope Sylvester, had a serious run-in with him in the past, and he basically, it's too long to get into the story now, but he, after having denied Arnulf's episcopacy for so long, he finally decided to bury the hatchet since he was Pope, and he gave Arnulf the bishopric of France, Archbishopric of France, without anyone being able to even challenge it, with the anathema of St. Peter attached. And that is how a medieval 11th century papal privilege would work in the period of growth of papal power over secular powers and cooperation with them.